The mockery of the Iron Works, June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea. The sky is a blinding ocean of blue, streaked with the contrails of hundreds of planes twisting, diving, and burning. The Pacific sun glares off the canopies of Grumman F6F Hellcats as they roar toward a swarm of incoming Japanese aircraft. Engines thunder, radios crackle with clipped voices. Beneath them, the vast gray hulls of the U.S. Fifth Fleet cut through calm waters. Carriers like the USS Lexington, USS Enterprise, and USS Yorktown ready to unleash hell. But less than 2 years earlier, the Japanese pilots had laughed. In the early months of 1943, when rumors spread through the Imperial Japanese Navy about America's new carrier fighter, pilots of the elite Tainan Air Group joked that the new Grumman looked more like a flying tank than a fighter. They called it the Iron Works, a mocking nod to Grumman's reputation for building heavy, over-engineered planes. To them, the F6F Hellcat was the very opposite of the graceful, agile Zero. One veteran Zero pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, reportedly scoffed when he first saw a captured photograph of the new fighter. Too heavy, too slow. The Americans build machines, not birds. The Japanese had reason to feel confident. In 1942, their Mitsubishi A6M0 was the undisputed ruler of the skies over the Pacific. It was fast, agile, and deadly in a dogfight. At the start of the war, Zero pilots shredded waves of U.S. Wildcats and Buffaloes with terrifying ease. But in a hangar on Long Island, engineers at Grumman Aircraft Engineering were already working quietly on revenge. The design bureau, nicknamed the Grumman Iron Works by its own employees, was famous for building planes that took punishment and kept flying. Their previous fighter, the F4F Wildcat, had been outclassed by the Zero, but had proven astonishingly durable. Now Chief Engineer William Schwendler and test pilot Robert Hall were pushing that philosophy further. The new aircraft would not just survive combat, it would dominate it. In January 1943, the first production Hellcat rolled out of the factory. It was massive compared to the Zero, taller, broader, and nearly twice as heavy. Its wings could fold to fit on carrier decks, and under the cowling, a monstrous 2,000 horsepower Pratt and Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine growled like an angry beast. To Japanese eyes, it was a brute, but to Grumman pilots, it was a revelation. During test flights over Long Island Sound, Hall took the Hellcat through a series of tight turns, dives, and climbs. When he landed, he simply said, "She climbs like an elevator." The plane could reach speeds over 370 miles per hour, carry 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, and shrug off hits that would have turned a Zero into confetti. Still, the skepticism lingered, both in Japan and in some corners of the U.S. Navy. Many believed the Hellcat was too big, too ungainly, and too late to make a difference. That changed in August 1943, when the Hellcat made its combat debut. Flying from the deck of the USS Independence near Marcus Island, U.S. Navy pilots finally tested their new bird in battle. They returned with glowing reports, multiple enemy aircraft downed, minimal losses, and pilots walking away from dogfights that would have been death sentences in Wildcats. Word spread fast through the Pacific theater. The Iron Works had built a monster that could take a hit, give one back, and come home for dinner. Meanwhile, across the sea, the mockery continued until the laughter stopped. By early 1944, as the U.S. Navy advanced across the Central Pacific, the Hellcat became the spearhead of American air power. It guarded bombers, hunted enemy fighters, and protected carriers from kamikaze raids. Its kill-to-loss ratio began to soar. And then came June 19th, the day the mockery died. That morning, the Japanese Combined Fleet launched Operation A-Go, a desperate attempt to halt the American advance on the Marianas. over 400 carrier-based planes, Zeeks, Judys, and Jills, roared off Japanese decks toward the waiting U.S. fleet. Above the carriers, Hellcat squadrons formed up in tight formations, climbing into the burning Pacific sun. The radio call sign that day would enter history: "Pancake is airborne." Within minutes, radar screens aboard the USS Lexington lit up. The first wave of Japanese aircraft was inbound. Over the next 8 hours, the largest aerial battle in the Pacific would unfold. A massacre that pilots would remember as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And at the center of it all was the Hellcat. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The sky above the Philippine Sea turned into a storm of metal and flame. By 10 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft, roughly 60 Zeros and bombers, was already closing in. On the radar screens of the USS Lexington, the blips looked like a swarm of angry bees. The order came through the radio: all fighters, Vector 310, Angels 25, intercept and destroy. From the carrier decks, the blue silhouettes of Hellcats launched in perfect sequence, one after another, their engines roaring like thunder across the open sea. Among them was Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu of Fighting Squadron 16, VF-16, a rising ace known for his calm voice and deadly aim. His Hellcat, marked White 19, climbed through 20,000 feet of heat shimmer as he scanned the horizon for the incoming enemy. At first, the Japanese formations looked familiar: Zeros escorting bombers, diving in neat V-shaped lines, just as they had done in 1941 and 1942. But this time, the Americans were ready. Unlike the early days of the war, the U.S. Navy now had radar-guided control, coordinated intercepts, and pilots with thousands of hours of combat experience. Each Hellcat climbed to its assigned altitude, holding formation with precision born from relentless training. Then, at 10:36 a.m., the two forces met. Vratsiu spotted a formation of Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers streaking toward the fleet, their sunlight-reflecting wings flashing like blades. He rolled his Hellcat into a dive, throttled up, and closed the distance fast, his Browning .50 calibers ready. "This is White 19, I've got bandits." Engaging. He fired in short, controlled bursts. The first Judy exploded in midair, scattering debris across the sky. A second went down moments later, trailing black smoke into the sea. Within minutes, Vratsiu had shot down 6 enemy aircraft, earning the title of Ace in a Day. Elsewhere, Hellcats shredded entire Japanese formations before they even reached bombing altitude. The combination of superior firepower, radar coordination, and rugged construction turned the battle into a one-sided slaughter. One Japanese Zero pilot, Petty Officer First Class Hiroshi Nishizawa, later described the horror of facing the new American fighter. "They came from the sun, from the sea, from behind. We could not turn with them. We could not climb with them. Their guns tore our wings apart. By noon, the sky was littered with falling aircraft, flaming streaks plunging toward the ocean below. Carrier deck crews on the USS Enterprise watched in stunned silence as Japanese bombers disintegrated before reaching their ships. Not a single U.S. carrier was hit. At 1 p.m., the second wave came and suffered the same fate. By the end of the day, Hellcat pilots claimed more than 300 enemy aircraft destroyed. The Japanese fleet lost nearly all of its veteran aviators, while American losses were minimal, only about 30 aircraft, most due to fuel shortages or landing accidents. On the flight decks, mechanics greeted returning pilots with grins and disbelief. The myth of Japanese air superiority had evaporated in a single afternoon. What had started as a daring counterattack by the Imperial Navy ended as one of the most lopsided aerial victories in history. As the sun set over the Pacific, the radio crackled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. One pilot's voice came through: "Hellcats can sure fight. The Japanese mockery of Grumman's Iron Works was over. What had once been dismissed as a clumsy beast had become the angel of death over the Pacific. But the story of the Hellcat wasn't just about the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Behind every victory lay months of design evolution, engineering genius, and relentless testing that transformed a heavy frame into a high-performance killer. To understand how the Hellcat became the weapon that turned the tide of the air war, we must go back to where it all began, in a Grumman factory on Long Island, forged in the Iron Works. Before the Hellcat ruled the Pacific skies, it was just another prototype on a drafting table at Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company known less for speed and elegance and more for stubborn durability. It was 1941. The United States hadn't yet entered the war, but the writing was on the wall. Across the Atlantic, Europe was already burning, and in the Pacific, the Zero had begun carving its legend across China and Southeast Asia. Reports from American observers were grim. Japan's new fighter was light, nimble, and devastatingly effective in a dogfight. In Grumman's Long Island headquarters, Chief Engineer William Schwendler studied those reports with unease. He and company founder Leroy Grumman knew that the U.S. Navy's main carrier fighter, the F4F Wildcat, was solid, but outdated. It could take punishment, yes, but it was slower, less maneuverable, and losing the race for air superiority. So they set out to build something new, a plane that would take the Wildcat's toughness and marry it with raw speed and power. The result began as Design G50, a stubby, awkward-looking prototype with thick wings and a massive radial engine. Pilots joked that it looked more like a bulldog than a bird. But Grumman's engineers didn't care about appearances. They cared about one thing: keeping pilots alive. Unlike Japanese designers who prized lightness above all, Grumman engineers worked like blacksmiths. They added self-sealing fuel tanks, armor around the cockpit, and a bulletproof windscreen. The wings were strengthened with heavy spars. Even the hydraulic lines were protected behind armored plates. The Hellcat would be heavy, yes, but indestructible. Test pilot Robert Hall was one of the first to fly it. On June 26, 1942, he climbed into the cockpit of the XF6F1 prototype at Grumman's Bethpage Airfield. The ground crew braced themselves as the massive Pratt & Whitney engine roared to life, shaking the hangars. Hall took off, climbing into a humid New York sky. The aircraft responded smoothly, powerful, balanced, and surprisingly forgiving for its size. The early model was powered by the Wright R2600 engine, but Hall knew it needed more. After landing, he told Schwendler simply, "She's good, but she needs teeth." Grumman engineers agreed. They replaced the engine with the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the same power plant used in the P-47 Thunderbolt. The new prototype, XF6F-3, could now reach 380 miles per hour, climb faster than the Zero, and dive without tearing its wings off. When Hall tested the upgraded Hellcat in October 1942, he came back grinning. "Now that's a fighter," he said. Production began almost immediately, before the prototype even finished testing. The Navy couldn't wait. Factories worked around the clock. Within a year, Grumman had transformed into a war machine of its own. Workers, many of them women, filled the assembly lines, riveting wings, welding frames, and painting the signature navy blue finish. They called themselves the Iron Works. It wasn't an insult anymore. It was a badge of pride. By the time the first F6F Hellcats rolled onto carrier decks in early 1943, the war in the Pacific had changed. Guadalcanal had shown that the Japanese could bleed, and the Americans were beginning to push back. But air superiority was still uncertain. Every mission was a gamble. Then the Hellcat arrived. Its first kills came in August 1943 over Marcus Island. when Hellcats from the USS Independence intercepted Japanese fighters. The results stunned everyone. Zeros fell in flames, while the bulky Grummans came home with bullet holes patched and pilots unscathed. By 1944, it was clear that the Hellcat wasn't just another fighter. It was a phenomenon. It could climb faster than the Zero, dive harder, and still turn tight enough to win a fight. In dogfights, it didn't rely on elegance. It relied on momentum. Pilots learned to fight using energy tactics, boom and zoom attacks that exploited the Hellcat's superior engine and firepower. The once mocked ironworks machine had become the Japanese pilot's nightmare. One captured pilot reportedly muttered after being interrogated, "When we see the Hellcat, we know the fight is already lost." But the story of the Hellcat's dominance didn't end with air superiority. Its true legacy lay in how it redefined naval warfare, turning the tide from defense to offense, from survival to victory. And that transformation reached its climax in one of the bloodiest, most decisive carrier battles of the war, Leyte Gulf. The Hellcat's finest hour, Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 24th, 1944. The skies over the Philippines burned once again. Dawn broke over the Leyte Gulf in streaks of gold and smoke. Below, the U.S. Navy's massive invasion fleet stretched across the water, hundreds of ships supporting General MacArthur's long-awaited return to the Philippines. Above them, Hellcats from Task Force 38 idled on carrier decks, their engines rumbling like caged beasts. The Japanese, desperate to halt the American advance, had launched Operation Shogo, a complex plan to lure Admiral Halsey's carriers away from the landing zones, while their battleships and cruisers ambushed the invasion fleet. It was a gamble born of desperation, but as the rising sun illuminated the Pacific, they didn't yet know that the Hellcat was waiting. At 8 a.m., radar screens aboard the USS Essex and USS Lexington picked up incoming contacts. Hundreds of aircraft approaching fast from the west. A swarm of Japanese bombers and fighters, launched from Luzon, and the remaining carriers of the Imperial Navy, was closing in. Over the flight deck, flight crews scrambled to launch interceptors. Among them was Lieutenant David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15. Calm, methodical, and deadly, McCampbell had already earned a reputation as one of the finest aviators in the Pacific. This morning, he would write his name into legend. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, climbed through the humid air in their F6F Hellcats, throttles wide open. As they reached 10,000 feet, they spotted the enemy formation, nearly 60 aircraft heading straight toward the fleet. Outnumbered 30-1, McCampbell gave the order anyway. "Let's go, Roy. Let's clean 'em up." The two Hellcats dove straight into the formation. McCampbell's 6 Browning .5s roared in long, rhythmic bursts. The first Zero exploded instantly. A second spiraled downward in flames. Within minutes, Japanese formations broke apart in panic as Hellcats from other squadrons joined the melee. The sky became chaos, smoke trails, tracer rounds, and burning wreckage. The deep drone of radial engines echoed across the sea as more Hellcats joined from USS Essex, USS Lexington, and USS Princeton. McCampbell didn't stop. He climbed, turned, and dove again, firing at anything that crossed his gun sight. By the end of that single sortie, he had shot down 9 enemy planes, the most ever by a U.S. Navy pilot in one mission. His wingman downed 6 more. Not a single American ship was hit. Below them, the Japanese carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, and Chiyoda were under relentless attack by American dive bombers. The once mighty Imperial Navy was collapsing. In a few hours, Japan lost its last operational carriers, along with hundreds of its most experienced pilots. On the radio, American pilots could hear the disbelief in their comrades' voices. "They just keep falling," one Hellcat pilot said. "It's like they don't know how to fight anymore." The Hellcat had broken more than Japan's Air Force. It had shattered its spirit. By the end of the Pacific War, the numbers were staggering. The F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter. Its kill ratio stood at an incredible 19-1. But statistics alone couldn't capture what the Hellcat meant to the men who flew it. It was their guardian, their weapon, and sometimes their lifeboat. Pilots came home with shredded wings, oil-soaked canopies, and bullet holes the size of fists. But they came home. In one of his post-war interviews, McCampbell put it simply, "She always brought me back. That's all that mattered." When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Hellcat had become a symbol of the United States' industrial and tactical dominance, a machine that embodied American ingenuity, resilience, and relentless production. The Japanese had once mocked it as a clumsy, overweight brute, but in the end, it was that very toughness that made it unstoppable. The Grumman Iron Works had built a monster, and that monster ruled the Pacific. Legacy of the Iron Beast. The war was ending, but the legend of the Hellcat was just beginning. August 15th, 1945. The announcement came crackling through radios aboard ships and airfields across the Pacific. Japan had surrendered. Cheers erupted from flight decks, gun turrets, and mess halls. Some men cried. Others just sat in silence, staring at the horizon. The endless sky that had once been filled with enemies was now quiet. On the deck of the USS Enterprise, rows of Hellcats sat idle, their wings folded like the tired arms of warriors finally at rest. The smell of oil and sea salt hung in the air. Mechanics leaned against their planes, pilots removed their helmets for the last time, and the world began to exhale. In less than 3 years, the F6F Hellcat had gone from a subject of ridicule to the undisputed champion of the Pacific War. It had crushed the myth of Japanese invincibility and rewritten the rules of aerial combat. But the story of its victory wasn't just written in dogfights. It was written in factories. At the height of production, the Grumman Iron Works was turning out one Hellcat every 63 minutes. Assembly lines stretched across Long Island, powered by tens of thousands of workers, men and women, engineers and welders, veterans and teenagers, each playing their part in a machine larger than themselves. Photographs from that time show smiling women in oil-stained uniforms riveting the wings of Hellcats, their hair wrapped in kerchiefs, their eyes sharp with focus. One worker wrote in chalk on the side of a fuselage, "For Pearl Harbor." That spirit, the merging of purpose, precision, and patriotism, became the heartbeat of American industry. It was why captured Japanese pilots couldn't believe what they saw when shown photographs of U.S. factories. Massive hangars producing more planes in a week than Japan could build in a month. It wasn't arrogance, it was efficiency, fueled by determination and loss. By the end of the war, Grumman had built over 12,000 Hellcats. Of those, more than 10,000 saw combat. Their pilots earned 305 aces, including legends like David McCampbell, Alex Vraciu, and Eugene Valencia. Each man carried the same sentiment, gratitude, not just for victory, but for survival. And for the Japanese, the plane they once mocked became a symbol of dread. The very phrase "Hellcats sighted" over radio channels meant the battle was already lost. When the dust of war finally settled, the Hellcat quietly faded from frontline service. Jet engines were coming. Technology was evolving. Yet for those who had lived through the crucible of the Pacific, nothing would ever replace it. In the post-war years, Grumman's Iron Works continued to build legends: the Panther, the Cougar, and eventually the F-14 Tomcat, but none carried the same mythic weight as the Hellcat. It was the right plane at the right time, simple, brutal, and invincible. Today, a few surviving Hellcats still fly at air shows, their engines thundering across the sky like echoes from another age. When you stand beneath one, the smell of oil and metal fills the air, and you can almost hear the ghosts of the men who once flew them. Their